All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of the Business Science Magazine podcast. I'm very fortunate today to be joined by Leslie Braxick. How are you doing today, Leslie?
I'm good, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So I'd like to do a quick intro of Leslie, but unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to be possible. We're very lucky to have Leslie as she is so accomplished. I'm going to try to get through as much of her bio as I can here. But Leslie is a veteran CEO coach, entrepreneur, consultant, author, educator, keynote speaker, and board member. Dr. Leslie Braxick co-founded My Next Season with Mark Lintz, fulfilling their vision to help executives bridge from productive corporate careers to purposeful next seasons. My Next Season contracts with prescient organizations that recognize the powerful influence departing leaders have on those who remain and on the company's brand and reputation. My Next Season offers different packages of services, and each company chooses the appropriate package for its leaders. As part of a broader vision of giving back, My Next Season contributes a portion of its revenue to not-for-profit endeavors in honor of its clients' careers. That's fantastic. Prior to launching My Next Season, Leslie co-founded management consulting firm, The Continuous Learning Group, now known as Alula, which specializes in strategy execution for Fortune 500 companies. Leslie led and grew CLG as its chairman and president CEO, while consulting as an executive advisor to CLG's senior-most clients. As part of a planned succession, she departed CLG to co-found My Next Season. Leslie is a prolific business writer and author. She recently co-authored the company's first book, Your Next Season, which I've got right here, advice for executives on transitioning from intense careers to fulfilling next seasons. A groundbreaking book providing unvarnished advice from hundreds of interviews with retired executives. Some of Leslie's other books are Preparing CEOs for Success, which I have here as well. What I Wish I Knew, and her first book, Unlock Behavior, Unleash Profits, which I've got on my bookshelf behind me. And Leadership Behavior That Drives Profitability in Your Organization. And that book made the Wall Street Journal's bestseller list. So I could go on for a while, Leslie, but I'm going to stop right there and just thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I'd like to, typically we get started with just talking about organizational behavior management in general.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your experience with OBM in behavior science.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you, I felt like I fell into behavior science. I didn't purposefully do it. When I was a kid, you know, I wanted to be an astronaut or a firefighter. I didn't want to be a behavior analyst. So how did you discover behavior science and organizational behavior management?
Oh, probably similarly, not an astronaut, but I was studying abroad in London, and I took a night course there called Psychology of Work, and everyone in the course was miserable. There were tradespeople, factory workers, doctors, lawyers, and people were angry. And they were angry that their supervisors were terrible. They were angry that they were working just as hard as the people next to them, but being paid half as much. They were angry that their bosses didn't communicate well. They were just literally everyone in the class came there frustrated, and they were, you know, quite a bit older than me. I was the youngest person by a long stretch. And I thought, who fixes these things? Because if these people are so angry, they're going to go home and parent angrily, they're going to be unhealthy and stressed in their life. And I just sort of became a little obsessed with who fixes these things. And I discovered the field of industrial psychology, and having been a psychology English double major as an undergrad, the only psychologist that really made sense to me was Skinner's work and behavioral psychology. So I thought, is there such a thing as a behavioral approach, a behavioral scientific approach to industrial psychology, and uncovered the field of organizational behavior management and the work that was being done at Western Michigan University, and then it all started.
Excellent, excellent. Western Michigan is not a bad place to get your initial training in OBM or behavior analysis for
Well, I
that.
felt
Uh,
very fortunate.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'd actually like to do kind of a hard left turn from OBM, and I'd love to dive into your next season.
Okay.
So I found this to be especially interesting because about a little over a year ago, I had a behavior therapy business that I sold,
Hmm.
and I owned that for maybe almost 9 years, and I felt like I was in the end, I think we had like 240 employees across like 3 states. And I'll never forget it. I had this conversation with Aubrey Daniels. And I said, he asked me about my company, and I very proudly said to him, we have 230 something employees across 3 states. And I'll never forget, he turned to me and said, so you have the employee curse. And I said, what's that? And he said, you have a lot of employees. And I remember we kind of joked about that back and forth. And then I ended up selling the company and realized that I had this big transition to make into my next life. So as it turns out, I started a consulting company after that, and I called it My Next Life.
Hmm.
And you have your next season. So
Hmm.
when I picked up your book and dove into it, you had so many different anecdotes in there that were relatable to me as a
Right.
previous CEO. So, what was the impetus for writing this book?
Well, the impetus for my next season came, I started getting so many calls from prior clients, people I had coached earlier in their career, and they would say, Leslie, we haven't talked in 5 years, 10 years, but you knew me better than anyone, and I'm retiring. What do you think I should do next? And I was like, I don't know what you should do next, and my neighbors and people are like, I know you coach executives, but I'm retiring. What do you think I should do? And I realized I had no one to refer them to. It wasn't an executive coach, it wasn't a life coach, but these were people that were incredibly productive. They loved their work. They were young. They were healthy. They had a long runway still ahead of them. And I thought, who does help these people? So that was sort of stirring in me. And I was kind of, casually helping people try and figure it out in the way that you just try and solve a problem. And then I was invited to a retirement celebration for a former client. He was the vice chairman of ExxonMobil. In fact, I was next to Rex Tillerson in line at his retirement celebration in Dallas, and Steve grabbed both of my arms in the receiving line and leaned in, and he just looked at me so intensely, and he said, after these beautiful speeches and these wonderful things that were said, and he leaned in and he said, Leslie, this is the worst day of my life. He said, I am so miserable. I am so unhappy. What am I going to do? I just, can I call you? I'm so unhappy. And so Steve called, and he said, I begged them to let me have an office to come to, and they wouldn't let me come and have a guest office, and what am I going to do? And Steve was happily married. He had three beautiful daughters and grandchildren, and he had a great life, and was very set financially. And so I thought, I'm remembering that Steve went to Duke, and I said, wouldn't Pratt School of Engineering love to have you on their board of advisors? Have you reached out to them? He's like, no, great idea. So he reached out to Pratt, and about a couple weeks or a few weeks later, he called back and he said, great news, Pratt wants to have me on their board of advisors, but they only meet once a quarter. So what do I do the rest of the time? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm working full time and got my kids and a life. And so I was sort of trying to be helpful, but I was very busy. And, a few months later, I got a call that Steve dropped out of a heart attack.
Oh,
And Steve was the picture of health. He didn't have an ounce of fat on his body. He worked out with a trainer. In fact, he had just finished his workout when he and his wife split the workout time with their trainer, and his wife was in her 45-minute time and came home and found him. And it just rocked me because Steve was my people. Steve was the people I had spent my entire career supporting, people that gave everything to their job, everything to the companies that they served. at the peril of so many other things in their lives. And there was not an understanding of how difficult this transition was for those people. And there was no one out there who A, understood it, and B, had any sort of structure or processes to be helpful. So I decided at that moment that I wanted to create a capability to provide support and structure to be helpful to that population, which were my people, the people that I had dedicated my whole life to working with and supporting.
No, that's a really powerful story. Something that I've been curious about is skill sets and learning.
Mm-hmm.
So something just, and I can only speak from my experience, but from my experience, I felt like I had been doing something for a certain period of time.
Mm-hmm.
I was managing a business for 10 years. I got very used to certain things like being in charge,
Yep.
delegating,
Yep.
being good at my job, being
Yep.
fluent at those skills. So can you talk a little bit about um, the requirement, I think, of developing a new skill set with your next season? And is there any transition difficulties with regards to not being in charge of other people anymore, not being in a leadership role?
Oh, for sure. You know, we call it a discernment process, but we encourage them to take a pause because most of them are exhausted. You know, what happens, and you've probably lived this if you were in a senior position, regardless of what you were doing. If you were in the top of your game, doctor, lawyer, accountant, doesn't matter, nonprofit, organizational leader, you know that in order to be successful in that role, you have had to give up a lot. You have probably taxed your interpersonal relationships, marriage, children, friendships. You've cut into vacation time. You have maybe gotten off nonprofit boards that you love because you've had to miss too many meetings because of travel and other work requirements. So you have created stress below the surface, just to be successful in whatever your main stage thing has been. So the first thing we say is take a pause, because that is real, and that there is a toll that comes with that. And the inclination is that people feel that they have an expiration date on usefulness. And so if they don't jump into something else, they're not going to be relevant, they're not going to be useful. And so there is a propensity to jump into something else to make sure that they're still useful. And we really encourage them to take that pause and to then go through a discernment process, because while being in charge and leading and managing, being, and doing your field is sort of one definition of what you've just done, I could look at those behaviors and define them slightly differently. I could define them as that you're comfortable being decisive. You enjoy helping people solve problems. You are comfortable engaging in issues that are ill-defined, right? So then if I spend time with you, I might uncover that you care enormously about climate or the environment or food security or some other things. So a lot of our clients don't have a lot of financial pressures at that point in their career. So they are so excited to think about the opportunity to take their gifts and repurpose them in new ways. But they don't go there automatically. We have to help them go through a process where they can rethink about how, recategorize their gifts and skills, and then think about, well, what do you care about? What do you love? What are things that you wish you could spend more time on but never had the chance to? So we've created a whole process. It's like a giant funnel of questions and things that they go through, and that's in a very succinct sort of description of what the process is, and then they get there.
Absolutely. So I'd like to follow up on that a little bit. And in your book, Preparing CEOs for Success,
Yeah.
you have a section in there where you talk about personal qualities and attributes of effective CEOs. And you mentioned 3 qualities, and we could, and I'd like to talk about the behavior aspect of this and defining that in a second too, but there's 2 that you bring up that caught my attention. So courage and continuous learning.
Yeah.
Do you feel like those are essential skills to make the transition into the next season?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, for absolutely. I mean, courage to be contemplative about new possibilities. It takes there you know our disc our icon, if you will, is my next season company is a bridge. And so the visual is to show the bridge sort of from here to there. And it takes courage to make that journey, right? You are comfortable on that one side of the bridge. You know it, it's familiar. You're driven by your Outlook calendar. You know how to behave, if you will. You know how life is structured there. And life on the other side of that bridge is scary. It's unclear. Your community is not there. All the things that have become familiar to you for decades, all the things that have defined success and unfortunately have come to define you are not part of what's on the other side of that bridge. So it takes courage to make the journey. And so one of the essentials, we say, one of the three essentials to make the journey is to have companionship for it. It is not one to be done alone. So whether it's an advisor or a friend or a family member or somebody that you trust, who you can speak honestly and openly with and be vulnerable with, is really important, because there is a lot of, for many people, it's a difficult transition. So courage is absolutely critical, but the continuous learning part is both is also where the fun comes in, right? Because if we believe that, and most executives under credit themselves with how much learning they do on an ongoing basis. So we have some clients that say, one of the first things I want to do is just sit and read 10 newspapers in the morning with coffee, because they are very aware of how much they're fed by reading the paper or being current on news. Whereas others, they want to take a class in a foreign language that they've wanted to study, or others, they want to do woodworking. We've had, there was one woman she was the top executive of a big financial investment company, and she asked for a sewing machine for Christmas. She wanted to learn quilting. So a big thing we helped her figure out was where she could take quilting lessons in her next season, because she had never done anything like that. So continuous learning, what's really cool about it in your next season is it's defined by things like fly fishing and quilting, or it could be around engaging in a Habitat for Humanity or some nonprofit, which stretches your skills sort of in new ways, or going on a board, or if you want to stay in the corporate sector, still taking what you've done and then applying it in new ways. So I think both of those are still highly relevant.
Absolutely. So I have so many questions. I find this topic particularly interesting because it's personally important to me. I feel like I'm still going through it. I just went through this transition maybe about a year and a half ago. But do you feel like, I feel like some of the things that you brought up, so Habitat for Humanity or being on a board or some of those other things, seem like they're less stressful and involve less work than the previous season. Do you recommend a stepping down from the amount of work, or do you leave it open for the CEOs to discover for themselves?
So the first, in our workbook, and actually in the appendix of the Your Next Season book, I think it's the very first question, but we call them parameters. But the very first thing you need to decide for yourself is sort of, I like to think of it as like the parameters that shape the box you're going to work in. So what are your geographic limitations? What are your financial needs? Do you have other obligations? Are you caring for an aging parent? Are you caring for a child with special needs? Do you have a child that's still at home and in school? What are the things that determine your next season in a non-negotiable sort of way? Do you have income needs? Do you have, what are the things that sort of define that? And once that's defined, then you can engage in the other activities of really being contemplative of what you love and what you enjoy and what you hate, what you wish you'd like never have to do again. But that upfront part's super important, because if this is your prime income earning season for you, then you don't want to dial down. You probably want to dial up, or at least stay where you were, so if that's kind of where you are in your stage. So for some people, their transition happens earlier than they expected. It didn't come with a wealth event. And so they still have very significant income earning needs. So what we do encourage them there is, don't assume that you just need to go do the same thing in a different company. So if you were a treasurer at the bank, don't assume that the only job out there for you is treasurer of another bank. Think through the skills that you had, what you enjoyed, and then are there other jobs out there that might be interesting to you? Maybe there's parts of the treasurer job you didn't enjoy. Maybe it was isolating. Maybe it was stressful. Maybe so we do encourage a discernment even when you're going to still have a full-time job. So it's not that it's a dial down, but we do say, look, use this time. And that's why we always say include a pause and and be thoughtful, because there may be things about what you just had that you'd like to walk away from and not have to do again. Or there may be things that you just learned that you could trade up and do something, based on how you brand yourself with that experience.
Absolutely. And, I would imagine that CEOs and people that are making that transition have a pretty good grasp on what they like and what they don't like at that point, right?
For the most part, but it's funny. Sometimes it's just funny things. Like they'll say, oh, I don't ever want to have to do another performance review again. Or, I'd prefer not to have to defend a budget to a board again. Or, I had one client and he said, I know exactly what I want to do, Les. I'm so sure about what I want to do. I'm going to go on 2 boards. And then I'm going to sail with my wife. We're building, so we had his sort of whole plan together. And then as I started asking questions about what he hated and what he didn't enjoy, what he wanted to leave behind, he said, I'm just so done with meetings. I just find meetings just so uninteresting, and I really want to take control of my calendar, because I've just been a slave to this Outlook calendar my whole career and have had to fly all over the world. He's had global operating responsibilities for his company, and he said, I really would like not to have to do that anymore. I'm like, okay, a board role of a public company, control of your calendar, doesn't want meetings. Those things don't line up. And so I said, let's talk about that, right? Which one of those is weighs more in your mind? If you're going to go on a public board, you're going to be told when those meetings are. First of all, you're going to be told when they are, when you have to be there. So that's not control of your calendar. And you're going to be in meetings all day and committee meetings. So he ended up not going on boards. He's like, oh my gosh, you're so right. I really don't want to deal with meetings, and I really do want control of my calendar. So he ended up going a different route and being an advisor of a private equity firm. So where he was able to maintain control of his calendar, and he was able to have the business teams come to him.
It's interesting, as you were talking about that, it brought me back to behavior science. And I wanted to ask how you utilize behavior science to help people make these transitions. So I heard a lot of identifying your vision, and then creating a mission for the next season in your life, and then operationally defining what you want to do, and then identifying your preferences and aversives. So is there any of that in there, or am I just seeing
all of it? No, for sure. I mean, the greatest gift, I think, that, if I could wave my magic wand, and Julie Smith and I used to talk about this all the time, if we could change the language, if we could simplify the language of behavioral science, I think it could have achieved a more mainstream application earlier. I think folks like Manny and others have taken it further than we ever really did, of achieving a more mainstream application of it. And I think the language was always a huge barrier of it. And so, and Julie really led the way for me for this and teaching this. But for example, teaching objectifying, right? If we can, so what I really did with that individual who said, I want to join boards, is I objectified what does that look like? Why, what does going on a board constitute? And simply by, which is a key part of the science of human behavior and OBM, right, is objectifying the behaviors that we're talking about. And that it all starts there, right? What are the behaviors we're pinpointing? What is really, and I feel like I do that all day long, is taking what somebody says that might be a very subjective or a very emotional sort of laden statement or feeling and objectifying it in a way that allows them to confirm that that's what they want, desire or are seeking. And then how do we construct the environment in such a way that encourages or discourages it? So I feel like it's embedded into everything that I do, but I don't always call it antecedent. I never actually call it antecedents, consequences. And I think in general, if we could have permeated, and when we figure out how to permeate the management without necessarily laboring it with the language, we can get further. Sometimes we need to be very precise about our language and what we're doing and make it more overt, but other times I think it slows us down and it's too much for people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I brought this up in like 3 or 4 of the interviews, but I was at a conference, an OBM conference a couple months ago, and I heard Judy Agnew speak, and she had a great line where she said, when you're consulting at organizations, you're going to have to use phrases and terms you're uncomfortable with, like employee engagement, things like that. And she said, It's okay to use that, just explain it behaviorally.
Yeah.
And it sounds a lot like I got some advice many years ago when I first got into behavior analysis, like 15 years ago. And somebody told me that you can explain just about everything with pinpointing and an ABC analysis.
Right.
It sounds a lot like what you were talking about there, and just using different terminology.
Yeah, I love Judy's statement, and I would take it one step further, and I would just say model it behaviorally. I feel our call is to model behaviorally, and then people ask, how did you do that? How did you reach that conclusion? And then when you show them, then you teach, then you can explain. So I feel that people know the difference. They see it. I think that's why our firm and others have been successful. They see that it's different. And they can't always describe why, but that gives you the platform to teach and explain why. And it is the science. That is the differentiator, always has been, always will be.
Absolutely. So we kind of went in reverse. I really wanted to talk about CEOs first and what makes a great CEO, but I was so enamored by the Your Next Season book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. For a lot of personal reasons, but I'd like to take a step backwards and talk a little bit about CEOs.
Yeah.
You've had so much experience, and something that really struck me was at the beginning of the Your Next Season book, you have quotes in here from different executives at different companies. And I'd just like to mention a couple of the company names that I see here. So you have ExxonMobil, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, Tenet Healthcare, the University of South Carolina, Purdue University, General Electric. These are major organizations, You were talking to and coaching the masters of the business universe. What are some of the skills that you found across the board were critical for being an effective CEO? I know that's a loaded question.
For their being an effective CEO and their companies.
Yeah.
I think it's funny. I think like so many things, it's the yin and the yang, and figuring out where the balance is of that, right? So it's confidence and humility. It is you know, it is a willingness to, you know, be courageous but consultative. You know, it's a willingness to act, but also, you know, be not, but be risk appropriate in your risk tolerance and so on. So I think the most successful CEOs are ones that seem to get that right. They are ones that have high integrity. They are ones that have high authenticity and courage. You know, honesty. I think those are the unshakable tenets of a great CEO. But that's the necessary but not sufficient for a great CEO. I think you have to be very visionary. You also have to be you have to be very comfortable being relentless in your restatement of this vision and the strategy. I see that over and over again, because people at different levels of the organization want to know how they connect in and how their efforts connect in. And as a CEO, you have this unique opportunity to reinforce and encourage their connection to the bigger purpose of the company. So whether they're in sales, supply chain, finance, IT, you can not only, you know, praise their work, but you can help say, and here's how that is helping us to achieve our mission, to be, you know, first in our, you know, customer satisfaction, or first in whatever it is that their sort of objective is trying to do. I think in today's day and age, companies that are choosing to care about things that matter in the world are CEOs that are differentiating themselves. So, you know, companies that are, you know, one of my clients, Prudential, has a big operation in El Paso. And so, you know, the day after the shooting there, the head of HR and the head of the North American business unit got on the plane and flew down there just to be present with their people. And they were, you know, they provided on the ground support and other sorts of things. And so another client, the Hartford Chris Swift, has taken on an initiative to combat the opioid crisis. And it's not just writing big checks, but they're, you know, he's convening employees of the company whose lives have been affected by family members who have struggled, who have lost family members, or family members who have struggled with, you know, with opioid issues and dependencies. And so those are CEOs that in this era are defining themselves in new ways. This is a generation in companies now that care about those sorts of things, and not that prior generations didn't care, but this is a generation that's holding our leaders accountable for showing up about things that matter in the world. And so I would add those things that weren't as visible when the What I Wish I Knew book came out, but are things I'm seeing today.
Absolutely. You know, and as you were talking about that, it made me think, and I heard somebody say this, I think it was on CNBC or Bloomberg, where they were talking about a transition for CEOs and C-suite professionals from being responsible to shareholders to now being responsible to stakeholders, which include their own employees, the community that they serve, and things like that. So is that part of what you were getting at?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think it's encouraging the employees to do work days themselves, to take a day and do a Habitat for Humanity work day, or to do local on the ground cleanups, or to just be involved in the community. Because, and again, I think in the past they may have done it. It's not that there wasn't social responsibility. It's just that that might have fallen under the marketing strategy, whereas now I think it's done for different reasons.
Do you feel like that changes? So sometimes when I would do OBM consulting, I would talk a little bit about the hierarchy at the organization. And we would always, not always, but a good portion of the time, we would try to flatten the hierarchy a bit and have people be accountable for each other instead of having that top-down hierarchy. Do you think that the hierarchy of the organization flattens a bit when who they're responsible to changes?
I do. I do. You know, Adam, it's an interesting phenomena, though. I will tell you that while well, well, I think what you're saying is true, and the verbiage is that that is desired. This is also a generation that seeks and wants feedback from supervision and from management at very high rates, very high frequencies, and very high degrees of specificity in a more traditional hierarchical way. So what we're seeing is that peer feedback is not sufficient. So if what you're saying were truly true, then the feedback in a peer-like or team would be sufficient, and it's not. So I think that while it's desired, it's stated as a desire when you look at data on exit interviews, unwanted attrition, why people are leaving, feedback from supervision and growth opportunities as stated from supervision and management continues to be, in the top 3 reasons why there's unwanted attrition of younger generation.
No, that's a fantastic point, and it makes me think about some of the work that Julie Smith is doing right now with, and it seems like performance feedback is at really the tippy top of what's important to today's companies.
It still is. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I know. I was talking to Julie about it in our interview a couple of months ago, and she was talking about the work that she's doing with performance feedback in hospitals and giving feedback to medical professionals and things like that. So, and I think as behavior analysts or behavior scientists, we understand the value of good prompt feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to stay on the CEO topic just for a little bit, but do you find that that there's been so we talked a little bit about how things are different now with shareholders and stakeholders and the emergence, or not the emergence of the importance of feedback, but I guess the people are talking about it a lot more. It's becoming put out there in the open a little bit more. But do you feel like how CEOs are running companies is different now than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago? Because I feel, and I know that's a loaded question again, but I feel like there's been such a shift in management and leadership from, let's say, the late 90s to where we are now.
Well, the things around them have shifted. So you have a tremendous amount of activism happening, which creates a lot of unrest and challenge and difficulty for CEOs. So shareholder activism, and anyway, that's a very difficult set of circumstances, and it puts a CEO on edge, and it disrupts the board. They're trying to secure board seats, and it's just a disruption factor, and that's happening. It's happening often, and it's disruptive to the companies and to the boards, and in some cases it leads to better business performance, but in all cases it's a disruptive factor that's happening with greater frequency. One of the things that I'm seeing that concerns me greatly, that no one is, to my eye, is talking about, is the increase in frequency with which lead directors are taking over the helm of the companies and pushing the CEOs out. And if you look at the recruitment, if you look at the profile of a board member, there's not a single behavioral descriptor for a board member that says, has any characteristics of being a CEO. There's a whole set of other characteristics for being a board member, but we are seeing with increased frequency where the CEO is being asked to step down ahead of his or her slated time, or unrelated to highly specific performance criteria, and the lead director is stepping in as CEO, which means they're bypassing CEO succession criteria, practices, everything.
Why do you think that's happening?
Well, why do I think it's happening? I think it's, in part, it's the activism is triggering it. I think that I think it's in part I think it's a large measure when you have shareholder activism, and so they're saying the CEO is not getting the job done. There's pressure to make a move very quickly, and so they make a move on the CEO, and so they're not going to go through a lengthy search process. So they take the lead director and sort of move him or her into that role. But that's a traumatic thing for an organization, and it's very traumatic, obviously, for the individual. And it's very, I mean, if a person has come up through the ranks and you have a proper CEO succession process, that person has spent their entire career, and the company has spent time preparing them for that role. And if you look at some of the quotes in the CEO study I did, I remember one CEO I interviewed, and he said, I spent years 1 and 2 learning the job and making a lot of mistakes. I spent year 3 and 4 fixing my mistakes, and by year 5 I was a great CEO.
That's a great and tough line. I'd like to stay on this for a bit, and this has become a topic that's emerged in a lot of these interviews that I've done, and I'd like to hear from a coaching perspective how you would help a CEO deal with some of these activism issues. I've talked to a lot of people in private equity, and they've told me that they think that we're moving in a direction where companies are going to have to make a decision to be political, to be on one side or the other. That businesses historically have wanted to remain apolitical and stay out of the issues. But as you said, this is something that's emerging on a pretty high frequency. And I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit, but you said something else that really caught my attention as well, is that they want that there's a demand for changes to happen overnight. And I see if a CEO or if a company makes a mistake, there's an immediate call for their resignation, like overnight. So this happened, okay, the CEO should resign. And I thought you made a great point there that the company is investing so much money into the CEO's development, and since it's such a difficult job, it takes them the first couple of years to make mistakes, the next 2 to fix their mistakes, and then by year 5, they're really starting to get their legs under them. So can you talk a little, and I know that was a long lead in there, I'm sorry about that, but
that's okay. And that was probably exaggerated. Just to go on, I don't want to go on record and say it takes 5 years for a CEO to get up to speed, because in most cases it's not. They are there by probably, I'd say, by year 2 in most cases. I've really developed, my practice has developed a specialization on first-time CEOs. That's almost exclusively all I coach now. And I can tell you they are getting there faster and faster, and they are learning it. But it is not easy, because there are so many things at play, both in terms of the portfolio of the businesses, their team, the board, changes of the board, things that are happening in the business environment. And when you have any kind of, activist underway, it just creates an additional sort of element of chaos to that situation. So they are moving quickly, and they are, working very hard, but I just have never ever seen the frequency with which there are lead directors that are in a very disingenuous way, almost participating in a coup at the board level, that then pushes a CEO who has devoted his or her life and career to the success of this business out. And I don't like it, and I'm seeing it happen with increased frequency. I think the next company you're going to see this happen at is Boeing.
With the plane incidents, that's right. Yes.
And you've just seen they've just split the roles, and you've just seen the that transition to the splitting, and the new the lead director has moved into the chairman of the board, and I predict that will be the next one that'll happen. But anyway, and not that. I mean, that one perhaps has some very visible, serious performance issues, and perhaps it's justified there. But even there, one would argue, to go that route for the succession process. All I'm saying is it's not that the succession shouldn't happen, it's how the succession's happening. That the succession is happening from a board going from a lead director to acting CEO versus a proper succession process at the CEO level. The board is set to govern, not to succeed the CEO. And so it confounds things across other companies where the board, where a CEO is saying, can I trust my board? Can I confide in my lead director? Because in all instances, there's 6 of them now that I've participated in, the CEOs are like, I confided in these people, and then they, they behind my back, engaged in activities that pushed me out. So anyway, it's an unhealthy trend that I'm not happy about personally. But anyway, what question did you ask me?
No, it's okay. I think it's related. I was really asking about activism and how to coach CEOs through that. I think that's such a struggle right now. We live in such a polarized society.
Yeah, for sure.
Since you brought up the activism, I think that's such a timely discussion. So how would you coach a CEO through it? Because as soon as there's one decision, yeah, percent of the population hates you.
Yeah, no, many of the CEOs I've worked with have had to deal with activist investors, and I would tell you that I find that in many cases, I'd arguably say in most cases, their engagement is justified based on the flat performance or earnings of the company, and they are not unreasonable when you engage with them. It's disruptive, but not always unreasonable. And in many cases, it's led to improved performance, or at least a sharpening of the pen of the companies that they've gotten involved in. So the coaching that I provide is to engage with them and understand what it is that they're trying to help achieve. And their ideas aren't always wrong, but their motivation for getting engaged usually, their ideas aren't always right. Their ideas of what's going to fix something are often overly simplistic. They don't always have a detailed understanding of the business and why it's not growing faster. But the idea that the company's not growing or that their market share isn't what it could be is generally not incorrect. So I think a lot of times it leads to good things happening at the company. It just happens in a very disruptive way. In a very stressful way for the CEOs, and in particular because they often then are also trying to get board seats, and so it just creates a thing unto itself. But my coaching to them 100% is to be responsive, understand what it is they're trying to do, and to work with them, because usually, they're not investing in a company that's not good or that doesn't have growth potential, and I would say, there's always, they're not bad people. They're not bad people, and they're smart business people. They just, I don't love their business practices, but they're smart people, and there's usually a reason that they're getting involved.
I'd like to ask just one more question about this before we close out, but do you feel like this trend is going to slow down? I feel like there's been, you see this going on for a while?
Yeah, because it gets reinforced.
Yeah.
These behaviors,
I feel like it gets reinforced in the moment, which obviously immediacy is important, but I feel like there's so much damage long term. I see some of these companies that react right away, and then you'll get their quarterly earnings come out and you'll see that they lost a ton of money, and it wasn't because of the original activist issue, is because of how they reacted to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, usually they're in and out, so they don't care. Oh, it's a terrible way. It's terrible for the companies longer term.
Right.
But for the activists, no, they get what they want. They come in, they buy up the stock, they come in, they push, the stock does a bump, they sell, they leave, and then the company is, the company's been harmed, and is, it's bad for the long term of the company. But is it going to slow down? No, because they're not in it for the long term. But and that's why we need great leaders that continue to have healthy growth of companies that are willing to be courageous, divest of underperforming assets in their business, or think creatively about what to do about them. the hardest thing, even as an entrepreneur in my little company, and I see this with CEOs of big publicly traded companies, the hardest thing to do is to walk away from something you're in love with. That's just not making money or that's not performing at the level it needs to, but you love it anyway, and you just can't. In a publicly traded company, you have to be willing to act on it. And so you can't, hope is not a strategy. So and if some are just going to, wait it out, an activist isn't going to wait it out. But, top performing CEOs are continuing to grow their company. They change up their portfolio and, their asset base is needed, and they'll keep the activist investors aren't going to go to a company like that. So that's how they keep them out.
That's unfortunate. But I thought that was a great analysis on your part, especially with regards to it's being reinforced, so it's going to continue. So I'd like to end on a positive note. I feel like we could have that discussion all day. I'm in total agreement with you on that. But I'd like to talk a little bit about where anyone that's interested in your work or hearing you speak, are you doing any speaking engagements coming up anytime soon? Do you have any new books beyond your next season that are coming out? Where can we find Leslie coming up soon?
You're sweet. So I publish in Smart Business Magazine every other month. Short pieces on transition related topics. We are working on our next book, so that'll be out in 2020. It's a sequel to the Your Next Season book, and it talks, in each chapter features an individual's story, an example of and there'll be a landing page that'll have even more stories and examples of what people have done in their next season and kind of reflections on their lessons learned. So that'll be out in 2020. A colleague of mine is doing a book on the spouse experience of Your Next Season, and so she has completed dozens of interviews of spouses, and that's a wonderful angle, and so that will also be out in 2020. Most of my speaking is in a targeted fashion. I'm doing a lot of work with CHROs now and helping them to really work with their organizations and provide transition support internally. So I don't have any public speaking engagements currently. I have some things with the HR Policy Association and the HR organizations primarily, but nothing sort of public, but I'll let you know if I do.
Excellent. I have to ask really quickly, are you going to come out, because maybe it's there and I missed it, but are you going to come out with an audiobook?
We haven't for that. What we're working on that, I'm excited about a number of projects we're working on. So at my next season, we have 3 lines of business. We have the retirement transition support, which the Your Next Season focuses on. We have the executive advising, which is the CEO transition, the kinds of stuff we were also talking about. But one we haven't talked about on this call, which is our fastest growing area, is called early career advising, and it's targeting transition support to college age up to 35-year-olds. So we were getting inundated with requests from people that were saying, oh my gosh, this was such a helpful program for me. Do you have anything for my 23-year-old, my 25-year-old, my 21-year-old who is working in their first job but not finding purpose and not finding joy in their life? And so we studied that space and created an offering for there, and now we're working with a team out of India to take that offering to a completely online format. And so we hope to have that launched in 2020 as well. And so we're really excited about, there's an animated video on our website that overviews the current offering of early career, but I think that'll continue to be a growth area for us, which is really targeting a much younger population and providing career transition support for them.
I love that. And your website, mynextseason.com?
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Excellent, excellent. All right, Leslie, I want to be respectful of your time, so thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, thank you.
And I'd like to thank our audience, and hope everyone joins us for another episode of Business Science Magazine podcast. Thank you.